Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to a time before craft breweries and artisanal cocktails. Before Prohibition, before happy hour existed as a concept. We're talking about the very beginning of humanity's long, stumbling relationship with alcohol. So dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's explore the ancient art of getting absolutely hammered. Because here's the thing. If you've ever wondered when humans first discovered that fermented things make you feel funny, the answer is embarrassingly early. Like, before we figured out how to write things down, before we built cities, possibly before we even decided that agriculture was a good idea. Our ancestors were getting tipsy while still living in caves, which frankly explains a lot about human history. The earliest evidence of intentional alcohol production dates back to around 7000 BCE in China. Archaeologists found residue in pottery jars that showed traces of a fermented beverage made from rice, honey, and fruit. So someone in Neolithic China looked at some old rice and thought, you know what, I'm going to let this sit in a jar for a while and see what happens. And what happened was humanity's oldest and most reliable hobby. But here's where it gets interesting, because we're not entirely sure if humans discovered alcohol by accident, or if we specifically went looking for it. There is a theory called the drunken monkey hypothesis, which suggests that our primate ancestors were already seeking out fermented fruit because it gave them a caloric advantage. Ripe, fermenting fruit has more calories and is easier to digest. So monkeys who enjoyed the taste of slightly fermented fruit and the mild buzz that came with it had an evolutionary edge. They ate more, they survived better, and occasionally they fell out of trees, but that's natural selection for you. This means humans might be genetically predisposed to enjoy alcohol, which is either a fascinating insight into human biology or a convenient excuse for bad decisions at office parties. Probably both. Now, let's drift over to ancient Mesopotamia. Around 4000 BCE, the Sumerians were brewing beer, not just drinking it casually. Mind you, they were worshipping it. They had a goddess, specifically for beer. Her name was Ninkasi, which translates roughly to the lady who fills the mouth. The Sumerians loved her so much, they wrote a hymn to her that doubles as a beer recipe. It's one of the oldest recipes we have. And instead of writing down something practical like how to grow wheat efficiently or basic medical procedures, they chose to preserve, for all eternity, instructions for making beer. Priorities. The Sumerian beer wasn't like what we drink today. It was thick, nutritious, and drunk through straws to avoid the sediment floating on top. Everyone drank it. Children drank it. It was safer than water, which was often contaminated, so entire civilizations were operating on a mild, constant buzz, which honestly explains some of their architectural decisions. Beer was so important in Mesopotamia that workers were often paid in beer rations, 4 liters a day for a laborer, 5 liters if you were a higher-level administrator, which means ancient middle management was definitely day drinking on the job. And somehow they still built ziggurats and invented writing. Imagine what they could have accomplished sober. Or maybe don't. Maybe they needed the beer. The ancient Egyptians were equally enthusiastic. They loved beer. They also loved wine, but beer was the drink of the common people. Everyone from pharaohs to farmers drank it. There's evidence that the workers who built the pyramids were paid partly in beer, which raises the question, were the pyramids built by a sober, well-organized workforce, or by thousands of mildly drunk people moving very large stones? We may never know, but the pyramids are still standing, so apparently it worked out. The Egyptians also believed that the god Osiris invented beer, because of course they did. They weren't going to credit some random brewer. It had to be divine intervention. Osiris, lord of the underworld and judge of the dead, apparently took time out of his busy schedule to teach humanity how to ferment grain. He's also the god of agriculture and rebirth, so it makes a certain poetic sense. Plant things, watch them grow, turn them into beer, get drunk, repeat. It's the circle of life. Egyptian beer was also thick and nutritious, drunk through straws, and considered a vital part of daily sustenance. It was given to children. It was included in religious offerings. The dead were buried with it, because apparently the afterlife was going to be long and you'd want a drink. Egyptians were so committed to beer that they had at least 17 different words for various types of beer. 17. They had fewer words for love than they did for beer, which tells you everything you need about their priorities. Now, let's talk about wine. Because while beer was the people's drink, wine was for the fancy folks. The earliest evidence of wine production comes from Georgia, around 6000 BC. Someone figured out that if you crush grapes and let the juice sit, it turns into something that makes you feel warm and philosophical. This was a game changer. Wine spread throughout the Mediterranean. The Greeks loved it. The Romans loved it even more. But here's the thing about ancient wine. It wasn't like modern wine. It was stronger, thicker, and often mixed with seawater, herbs, or honey. Drinking wine straight was considered barbaric. Civilized people diluted it with water, usually at a ratio of 1 part wine to 3 parts water, because apparently getting drunk slowly and politely was a sign of sophistication. The Greeks had an entire social institution built around drinking. The Symposium, which sounds educational, but was actually just a formalized drinking party for aristocratic men. They'd recline on couches, drink diluted wine, discuss philosophy, recite poetry, and occasionally engage in activities we won't get into because this is a family-friendly sleep video. The Symposium was where important political and philosophical discussions happened. Democracy was debated over wine. Socrates spent his evenings at symposia, drinking and annoying people with questions, which explains a lot about philosophy. The Greeks also had a god of wine, Dionysus, god of wine, madness, theater, and religious ecstasy. His followers, mostly women called Maenads, would go into the mountains, drink enormous amounts of wine, and engage in frenzied dancing and rituals that allegedly involved tearing animals apart with their bare hands. Greek religion was intense. Dionysian festivals were massive public events where social norms were temporarily suspended. People wore masks, drank freely, and celebrated chaos. It was essentially spring break for ancient Greece, but with more religious significance and fewer arrests. Probably, the Romans adopted Dionysus and renamed him Bacchus, because Romans loved taking Greek ideas and slapping Roman labels on them. Bacchanalia festivals became so wild and uncontrollable that the Roman Senate tried to ban them in 186 BCE. The Senate issued a decree that Bacchanalian celebrations were breeding grounds for conspiracy and immorality, which was true, but also, the Romans drank wine at every meal, so their moral high ground was questionable at best. Romans were serious about their wine. They categorized it by region, vintage, and quality. Wealthy Romans collected expensive wines the way modern billionaires collect art. The most prized wine was Falernian, from Campania, which was aged for decades and supposedly tasted like concentrated honey and fire. It was so alcoholic that it could be lit on fire, which Romans occasionally did at parties because subtlety was not their strong suit. Romans also watered down their wine, but not as much as the Greeks. They had hot wine, spiced wine, and wine mixed with exotic ingredients. They drank wine for breakfast. They drank it at lunch. Dinner was essentially an extended wine tasting session with food as an afterthought. Roman banquets could last for hours, with guests reclining on couches, eating elaborate dishes, and drinking steadily throughout. Vomitoriums existed, although not for the reason people think. They were just hallways for crowds to exit through. But the fact that people believe Romans had designated vomiting rooms tells you everything about Rome's reputation. The Roman military ran on wine. Soldiers received a daily ration called posca, which was wine mixed with water and sometimes vinegar. It was cheap, it was hydrating, and it prevented diseases. The Roman legions conquered most of Europe while mildly drunk, which is either impressive or terrifying, possibly both. Before we drift further into history's happiest haze, a quick note. If you're enjoying this gentle journey through humanity's relationship with fermentation, consider hitting that subscribe button. Maybe give the video a like. It helps the algorithm understand that people enjoy learning about ancient intoxication techniques while falling asleep. And honestly, that's a beautiful thing. Now, back to the drinks. Let's talk about mead. because while beer and wine were dominating the Mediterranean, Northern Europe was busy getting drunk on honey. Mead is fermented honey water, and it's possibly even older than beer or wine. Honey ferments naturally if you add water and let it sit. Bees have been making honey for millions of years. At some point, some curious human found a hollowed-out tree full of rainwater and fermented honey, tasted it, and decided this was the best thing that had ever happened. Mead shows up in Norse mythology, Anglo-Saxon poetry, and Celtic legends. The Norse had an entire mythological explanation for Mead's existence. According to legend, the gods created a wise being named Kvasir from the combined spit of two divine factions. Because Norse mythology is subtle like that, Kvasir traveled the world, sharing wisdom until two dwarves murdered him, drained his blood, mixed it with honey, and created the mead of poetry, which granted anyone who drank it the gift of eloquence and knowledge. So Norse mythology's explanation for why drunk people think they re-profound is that they re-channeling the blood of a murdered wise god mixed with honey. That's either deeply poetic or deeply disturbing. Again, probably both. Mead halls were central to early medieval society in Northern Europe. Kings and warriors gathered in mead halls to drink, boast, and occasionally fight. The entire social structure of Anglo-Saxon and Norse culture revolved around these drinking sessions. Loyalty was pledged over mead. Battles were planned over mead. Epic poems were recited while everyone was thoroughly drunk. Beowulf spends a significant portion of his story drinking mead in Hero, the Great Mead Hall, before fighting monsters, which raises the question, was Beowulf sober when he fought Grendel, or was he running on liquid courage? The poem doesn't specify, but given the culture, he was probably at least tipsy. Viking warriors drank mead from horns, which sounds cool until you realize you can't set a horn down without spilling it. So once you started drinking, you had to finish. This was probably intentional. Vikings were efficient. Now let's drift eastward to Asia, where alcohol was developing along completely different lines. We already mentioned ancient Chinese rice wine from 7000 BCE, but Chinese drinking culture gets much more sophisticated. By the time of the Shang dynasty, around 1600 BCE, the Chinese were producing elaborate bronze vessels specifically for serving alcohol. These weren't simple cups. They were ornate, ceremonial, and extremely expensive. Alcohol was central to religious rituals, ancestor worship, and state functions. The Chinese also figured out distillation early, possibly as far back as the 1st century CE, though evidence is debated. Distillation concentrates alcohol, creating spirits rather than beer or wine. This was a technological leap. Suddenly you could get dramatically more drunk with dramatically less liquid. Efficiency, baijiu, a distilled grain alcohol, became China's national drink. It's extremely strong, usually between 40 and 60% alcohol, and tastes like fire. It's still the most consumed spirit in the world by volume, which tells you something about China's commitment to the craft. In Japan, sake was being produced by at least 300 CE. Sake is technically a type of rice wine, though the brewing process is closer to beer. It was originally produced by the imperial court and Shinto shrines, because in Japan, as in most places, religious institutions understood the value of controlled intoxication. Sake was used in religious ceremonies, offered to gods, and consumed during festivals. The Japanese emperor employed official sake brewers. There was a government position for making alcohol. That's commitment to infrastructure. India developed a variety of fermented drinks, including sura, a grain-based alcohol mentioned in ancient Vedic texts. Sura was consumed during rituals, but attitudes toward alcohol in India were complicated. Some texts praised it as a gift from the gods. Others condemned it as spiritually corrupting. This tension exists throughout Indian history, with alcohol being simultaneously celebrated and forbidden depending on the era, religion, and social class, which is honestly a pretty reasonable response to alcohol. The ancient Persians loved wine. They wrote poetry about it. Persian poetry is full of references to wine, drunkenness, and the philosophical insights supposedly gained from both. The poet Hafez dedicated entire verses to the spiritual experience of getting drunk. Omar Khayyam wrote, "A loaf of bread, a jug of wine, and thou," which is a lovely romantic image until you realize he's prioritizing wine over his companion. Priorities, again. Persia's relationship with alcohol shifted dramatically with the rise of Islam in the 7th century CE. The Quran explicitly forbids alcohol. It's considered haram, forbidden, because it clouds judgment and impairs the ability to pray properly. This was a significant cultural shift in a region that had been producing and consuming wine for millennia. Islamic scholars debated the exact boundaries of the prohibition. Was all alcohol forbidden, or just intoxication? Could you drink a little wine, or was any amount sinful? The general consensus landed on complete prohibition, but enforcement varied widely by region and era. Despite the prohibition, wine production continued in many Islamic regions, often by non-Muslim populations. And some Muslims drank anyway, because religious rules and human behavior don't always align neatly. Medieval Islamic physicians wrote extensively about alcohol's medical properties, which was a convenient loophole. It's not drinking for pleasure, it's medicine. A rationalization as old as alcohol itself. Meanwhile, in medieval Europe, monasteries were the primary producers of beer and wine, because monks, who had taken vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, still needed something to get them through the day. Monasteries had the resources, the labor, and the incentive to brew. Beer was nutritious, safe to drink, and didn't count as breaking a fast since it was liquid. Liquid bread was the phrase they used. Monks could drink beer during Lent, during fasts, during basically any time eating was forbidden, because technically they weren't eating. Trappist monks, Benedictine monks, and other orders became famous for their brewing. Some of these beers are still produced today, centuries later, using medieval recipes. Chimay, Westmail, all these are beers created by monks who dedicated their lives to God and also to making objectively excellent alcohol. The monks would drink the beer themselves, sell it to fund the monastery, and give it to travelers seeking shelter. Hospitality and intoxication, hand in hand. The same was true for wine. Monasteries in France, Germany, and Italy cultivated vineyards and produced wine for religious ceremonies and daily consumption. Communion wine was essential, obviously. You can't have mass without wine. But monks also drank wine with meals, and they got very good at making it. Many of Europe's most famous wine regions were established by monastic orders. Champagne, Burgundy, the Rhine Valley, these were monk projects. Religious devotion and alcoholic excellence intertwined. So, monks were getting quietly drunk in their cloisters. But what about everyone else? Let's talk about medieval Europe's broader drinking culture. Because if you think modern society has a drinking problem, medieval Europe would like a word. Everyone drank alcohol. Everyone, children included. Breakfast involved ale, lunch involved ale, dinner involved ale, and possibly wine if you could afford it. Water was unsafe in most urban areas. Rivers were contaminated with waste, both human and industrial. Wells could be tainted, but fermented beverages were safer because the brewing process killed bacteria. So instead of improving sanitation, medieval society just stayed mildly buzzed. The average daily consumption of ale in medieval England was around a gallon per person per day. That includes children, though they usually got small beer, a weaker version with lower alcohol content. But still, a society running on a gallon of ale per person per day is not a sober society. Medieval ale wasn't like modern beer. It was thicker, cloudier, and had to be consumed fresh because it spoiled quickly without hops. Hops weren't widely used in England until the 15th century. Before that, ale was flavored with a mixture of herbs called gruit, which varied by region and sometimes included mildly psychoactive plants. So medieval ale didn't just make you drunk, it made you weird. Alewives brewed and sold ale. These were usually women, often widows, who brewed at home and sold directly to the community. Brewing was considered domestic work, like cooking or spinning, but it was also semi-regulated. Alewives had to register with local authorities and maintain quality standards. If the ale was bad, they could be fined or publicly punished. The punishment sometimes involved the cucking stool, a chair on a long pole used to dunk the offender into a river or pond. Because nothing says your ale was subpar, like ritualized public humiliation involving cold water, taverns and alehouses became central to community life. They were places to gather, gossip, conduct business, and drink steadily from morning until night. Contracts were signed in taverns. Disputes were settled in taverns. Taverns were loud, crowded, and frequently violent. Medieval people did not have our modern concept of drinking responsibly. The upper classes drank wine, which was imported and expensive. England's wine came mostly from France, particularly Gascony, which England controlled for a while. The 100 Years' War, that long, messy conflict between England and France, disrupted wine imports, which probably made both sides more irritable. Nothing fuels international conflict like a wine shortage. Wealthy households had dedicated butlers responsible for the wine cellar. Butler comes from bottler, the person who managed bottles and casks. This was a position of significant responsibility and trust, because wine was valuable. A good butler knew vintages, storage techniques, and exactly how much wine the household had consumed, which meant they also knew when the lord was drinking more than usual. But discretion was presumably part of the job. Medieval feasts were legendary drinking events, multi-course meals lasting hours, with wine flowing continuously. Guests were expected to drink toasts to the host, to each other, to absent friends, to the king, to saints, to basically anyone who could be named. Refusing a toast was an insult. So once the toasting started, you were committed. Medieval nobles drank from enormous communal cups that were passed around the table. These weren't individual servings. These were shared vessels, sometimes holding several liters, and everyone drank from the same cup. Hygiene was not a priority. The wassail tradition, still vaguely remembered in Christmas carols, was a medieval drinking ritual. Wassail comes from the Old English ways hyle, meaning be healthy. People would go door to door with a large bowl of spiced ale, offering drinks and expecting hospitality in return. It was caroling, but with more alcohol and fewer songs. The wassail bowl was passed around, everyone drank, and the evening progressed from friendly to chaotic, depending on how many houses you visited. By the late Middle Ages, distillation technology had spread from the Islamic world and Asia into Europe. Distilled spirits appeared, and they were called aquavita, water of life, because medieval people had a gift for dramatic irony. Aquavita was initially used as medicine. Alchemists and physicians distilled it, claiming it could cure almost anything. Plague, aquavita. Headache, aquavita. Sadness, definitely aquavita. Gradually, people realized that aquavita was excellent for getting extremely drunk very quickly. Distillation spread. By the 16th century, every region had its own version. Scotland had whiskey, Ireland had whiskey, France had brandy, Eastern Europe had vodka, Germany had schnapps. The specific grains, fruits, or potatoes used varied, but the goal was universal: concentrated alcohol. Whiskey, spelled without an E, in Scotland, comes from the Gaelic wispitha, also meaning water of life, because, apparently, everyone independently decided that distilled alcohol was vital to survival. Scottish monks likely started distilling whiskey as early as the 15th century, using leftover barley from brewing. It was harsh, unaged, and mostly used for medicinal purposes. Over time, Scots refined the process, aged it in barrels, and created the whiskey industry that still defines Scotland today. The Irish claim they invented whiskey first, and the debate between Scotland and Ireland over who distilled first is ongoing, passionate, and probably conducted over drinks. The historical evidence is unclear because both regions were distilling by the late medieval period, and record-keeping was not a priority when you were secretly making alcohol to avoid taxes. Vodka emerged in Eastern Europe, either Poland or Russia, depending on who you ask. Both claim to have invented it. Both have been drinking it for centuries. Vodka was originally made from grains or potatoes and distilled to very high proof. It was cheap, effective, and became central to both Polish and Russian culture. Russian drinking culture is famously intense. Vodka was consumed at every occasion, social or otherwise. Peter the Great allegedly forced his court to drink with him for hours during meetings, which explains some of his policy decisions. In France, brandy became the refined choice. Cognac and Armagnac are brandies distilled from wine, and the French turned distillation into an art form. Brandy was aged in oak barrels, classified by quality, and consumed by aristocrats who wanted to feel sophisticated while getting drunk. It worked. By the time we reached the 16th and 17th centuries, Europe was awash in alcohol. Every social class, every region, every profession had its drink of choice. Sailors drank rum, soldiers drank whatever was available, farmers drank ale, merchants drank wine. Everyone, constantly, was drinking. The age of exploration spread European drinking culture worldwide. Colonizers brought alcohol to the Americas, Africa, and Asia. They introduced wine and beer to indigenous populations who had their own fermented beverages, but nothing as strong as distilled spirits. The impact was devastating in many cases. Alcohol became a tool of colonization, used in trade, diplomacy, and exploitation. Native Americans had fermented beverages made from corn, cactus, and other plants, but these were generally low in alcohol and consumed during specific rituals. European traders introduced rum, whiskey, and brandy, often deliberately, to facilitate unequal trade agreements. The consequences were catastrophic and still felt today. In Africa, palm wine and other traditional drinks existed, but European colonizers brought rum and gin. Gin, particularly, became a tool of the slave trade. Traders used alcohol to barter for enslaved people, creating dependency and exploiting communities. It was calculated, cruel, and effective. Meanwhile, back in Europe, gin was causing its own crisis. The gin craze of 18th century London is one of history's clearest examples of what happens when cheap, strong alcohol floods a desperate population. Gin was introduced to England by Dutch soldiers, and the English took to it enthusiastically. By the 1720s, gin production was essentially unregulated. Anyone could distill it. It was cheap, potent, and everywhere. London's poor drank gin instead of beer because it was more affordable and more effective. The phrase, "drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence," referred to gin. You could get catastrophically intoxicated for almost nothing. The social consequences were immediate and dire. Child mortality spiked, crime increased, public drunkenness was epidemic. William Hogarth's print Gin Lane depicted London as a hellscape of addiction, neglect, and despair. A mother, drunk on gin, drops her baby over a railing. A man wastes away while a pawnbroker thrives. Buildings crumble. It's bleak. Hogarth contrasted it with Beer Street, where everyone drinking beer is healthy, productive, and happy. The message was clear: beer good, gin bad, which was a bit simplistic, but effective propaganda. The government tried to regulate gin through a series of gin acts, taxing production and restricting sales. It didn't work. People rioted. Illegal distillation continued. Eventually, the government gave up on prohibition and focused on regulation, licensing, and quality control. The gin craze subsided, but not before demonstrating that cheap, accessible, strong alcohol and urban poverty are a terrible combination. Across the Atlantic, colonial America was also drinking heavily. The Puritans, despite their reputation, drank constantly. They considered alcohol a gift from God. Water was dangerous. Alcohol was safe. The Mayflower landed at Plymouth Rock partly because they were running out of beer. That's not a joke. The ship's beer supplies were low, so they stopped earlier than planned. America was founded, in part, because people needed a drink. Colonial Americans drank cider, beer, and rum. Apple orchards were everywhere, because apples were primarily for cider, not eating. Hard cider was the default beverage. Children drank it. Breakfast included it. Johnny Appleseed, that wholesome American folk hero, was spreading apple trees so people could make more alcohol. He was a mobile brewery. Rum, distilled from Caribbean molasses, became America's spirit of choice. The Triangle trade brought molasses from the Caribbean to New England, where it was distilled into rum. The rum was traded in Africa for enslaved people, who were brought to the Caribbean to work sugar plantations, which produced molasses. The entire economy was built on sugar, slavery, and rum. It's horrifying and historically accurate. American taverns were community centers. Political discussions happened in taverns. The founding fathers met in taverns. The American Revolution was planned in taverns. The Green Dragon Tavern in Boston was nicknamed the headquarters of the Revolution. Decisions that shaped the nation were made by men who were, statistically speaking, probably at least a little drunk. The Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. The delegates drank throughout. We have records of their bar tab from a celebration dinner in September. They consumed 54 bottles of Madeira, 60 bottles of claret, 8 bottles of whiskey, 22 bottles of port, 8 bottles of hard cider, and large quantities of beer and punch. That's for 55 people. They drank more than a bottle of wine per person, plus everything else. And then they signed the Constitution. American democracy was forged in alcohol. George Washington operated a whiskey distillery at Mount Vernon. It was one of the largest in America. Thomas Jefferson loved wine and kept detailed records of his collection. Benjamin Franklin wrote drinking songs. The founding fathers were enthusiastic, accomplished drinkers. By the 19th century, alcohol consumption in America reached its peak. The average American drank about 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year. That's roughly 90 bottles of whiskey per person annually. Americans were drinking more than almost any society in history. Whiskey was cheap, widely available, and consumed at all hours. Breakfast whiskey was normal. Workers drank during breaks. Alcohol was everywhere. This level of consumption had predictable consequences. Public drunkenness, domestic violence, poverty, and health problems were rampant. The temperance movement emerged in response, arguing that alcohol was ruining society. And they had a point. The temperance movement started reasonably, encouraging moderation, but it gradually radicalized. Organizations like the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the Anti-Saloon League pushed for complete prohibition. They argued that alcohol was a moral evil, that it destroyed families, and that banning it would solve society's problems. They were passionate, organized, and politically effective. Kerry Nation, a temperance activist, became famous for walking into saloons with a hatchet and smashing bottles, barrels, and furniture. She was arrested dozens of times and became a folk hero to prohibitionists. The movement gained momentum, and in 1920, the 18th Amendment was ratified, and prohibition began. The manufacture, sale, and transportation of alcohol were illegal in the United States. It was a massive social experiment, and it failed spectacularly. Prohibition is one of history's clearest examples of good intentions colliding with human nature and losing badly. The idea was simple: ban alcohol, and society's problems disappear. Crime drops, families thrive, productivity increases, everyone becomes healthy, moral, and prosperous. It was optimistic. It was naive, and it was doomed from the start. The 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which enforced it, went into effect on January 17, 1920. Overnight, the legal alcohol industry vanished. Breweries closed, distilleries shut down, bars and saloons locked their doors, and absolutely nothing else changed, except that now everything was illegal. Because people did not stop drinking, they just started drinking illegally. Prohibition created a massive black market almost immediately. Organized crime syndicates, which had existed before but were relatively small, exploded in size and power. Gangsters like Al Capone, Lucky Luciano, and Bugs Moran built empires on bootleg alcohol. They smuggled it, produced it illegally, and distributed it through networks of speakeasies and underground bars. Speakeasies were everywhere. The name supposedly came from the need to speak easy or quietly about the bar's location to avoid police attention. Though given how many speakeasies existed, police attention was apparently not that hard to avoid. Estimates suggest there were over 30,000 speakeasies in New York City alone during Prohibition. That's more than the number of legal bars before Prohibition. Banning alcohol somehow created more places to drink. Speakeasies ranged from grim basement operations to glamorous nightclubs. Some required passwords. Some had hidden entrances behind bookshelves or through fake storefronts. Others were just regular buildings where everyone understood the rules: don't talk to police and pay in cash. The atmosphere was festive, rebellious, and slightly dangerous. Jazz music flourished in speakeasies. The Roaring Twenties happened in speakeasies. Prohibition didn't stop drinking, it made drinking cool. Women, who had rarely been seen in saloons before Prohibition, flocked to speak. Drinking in public became socially acceptable for women, partly because speakeasies were technically illegal for everyone, so traditional gender norms didn't apply. Flappers, those iconic 1920s women with short skirts and bobbed hair, drank openly, smoked cigarettes, and scandalized older generations. Prohibition inadvertently advanced gender equality in drinking culture, which was probably not what temperance activists had in mind. The alcohol people drank during Prohibition was often dangerous. Bootleggers weren't concerned with quality control. They distilled liquor in unsanitary conditions using questionable ingredients. Industrial alcohol, which was deliberately poisoned by the government to prevent consumption, was sometimes redistilled and sold. People went blind from methanol poisoning. People died. The government's solution was to poison the industrial alcohol more thoroughly, which killed more people. Prohibition didn't reduce drinking, it just made drinking deadlier. Organized crime thrived. Al Capone's Chicago outfit earned an estimated $60 million annually from bootlegging. That's roughly $1 billion in today's money. Capone became one of the wealthiest, most powerful men in America by selling something that had been legal a few years earlier. He bribed police, judges, and politicians. He orchestrated the St. Valentine's Day massacre, where his men murdered 7 rival gang members in broad daylight. Prohibition created an environment where gangsters operated openly, with impunity. The government tried to enforce prohibition, but it was hopeless. The Bureau of Prohibition employed a few thousand agents to police a nation of over 100 million people. Smuggling operations brought alcohol across the Canadian and Mexican borders. Rum runners shipped alcohol from the Caribbean. People brewed beer and distilled spirits at home. Vineyards sold grape bricks with a helpful warning label: do not add yeast and sugar and let sit for 21 days, or this will turn into wine. It was a wink and a nod masquerading as compliance. Enforcement was inconsistent. In rural areas, moonshiners produced illegal whiskey in hidden stills. In cities, speakeasies operated with minimal interference. Wealthy people stockpiled alcohol before Prohibition and continued drinking from private reserves. Doctors prescribed medicinal alcohol for ailments both real and imaginary. Priests and rabbis could still obtain wine for religious ceremonies. Communion wine sales skyrocketed, with some churches seeing membership increases that were suspiciously convenient. By the late 1920s, public opinion had turned against Prohibition. The economic benefits hadn't materialized. Crime had increased. Corruption was rampant. The Great Depression hit in 1929, and suddenly the idea of taxing alcohol sounded appealing. The government was broke. Breweries and distilleries could provide jobs and tax revenue. Prohibition, which had been sold as a moral imperative, was now an economic liability. Franklin D. Roosevelt campaigned on repealing Prohibition in 1932. He won in a landslide. In 1933, the 21st Amendment was ratified, repealing the 18th. Prohibition ended after 13 years. It remains the only constitutional amendment ever fully repealed, which tells you how badly it went. The day Prohibition ended, December 5, 1933, was celebrated nationwide. Breweries reopened, liquor stores opened, bars resumed business. People lined up to buy legal alcohol, and the industry roared back to life. Anheuser-Busch sent a team of Clydesdales to deliver beer to the White House, creating a publicity stunt that became an enduring tradition. America moved on, collectively agreeing never to try that again. But Prohibition had lasting effects. Organized crime didn't disappear. Mafia families that built power during Prohibition continued operating in other industries. The culture of speakeasies influenced American nightlife. making cocktails and mixed drinks more popular. Pre-Prohibition, people mostly drank beer and straight whiskey. Post-Prohibition, cocktails became fashionable. Bartenders had experimented during Prohibition to mask the taste of bad bootleg liquor, creating drinks like the Sidecar, the French 75, and variations on classics. The cocktail culture of the 20th century is a direct result of Prohibition. Meanwhile, Europe had watched America's Prohibition experiment with fascination and smugness. European countries didn't attempt full prohibition, though temperance movements existed. Scandinavian countries implemented state monopolies on alcohol sales, controlling distribution without banning it entirely. This system, still in place today in countries like Sweden and Norway, limits where and when alcohol can be purchased but doesn't prohibit it. It's a compromise that sort of works, though Scandinavians still drink plenty. Britain had its own complicated relationship with alcohol. Pub culture was central to British life. The Continue 808 government regulated pubs heavily, controlling licensing, hours, and sales. During World War I, the British government restricted pub hours to reduce absenteeism in munitions factories. Workers were allegedly showing up drunk, which is understandable given they were manufacturing explosives, but not ideal. Pubs were forced to close in the afternoons and couldn't serve alcohol past 10 or 11 p.m. These restrictions lasted for decades, only fully relaxing in the late 20th century. Russia's relationship with vodka is legendary and tragic. Vodka was central to Russian culture, consumed at every occasion. The Russian government derived enormous revenue from vodka taxes. During World War I, Tsar Nicholas II implemented a brief prohibition, hoping to improve military efficiency. It backfired. The government lost revenue. People drank industrial alcohol and homemade spirits instead. Prohibition was quietly abandoned. After the Russian Revolution, the Soviet government initially continued restricting alcohol, but eventually reversed course, realizing they needed the revenue. Vodka production resumed, and the Soviet Union became one of the world's largest alcohol consumers. Soviet leaders had complicated relationships with vodka. Stalin drank Georgian wine. Khrushchev preferred vodka and beer. Brezhnev drank heavily, as did much of the Soviet leadership. State banquets involved hours of toasting and drinking. Foreign diplomats attending Soviet functions had to pace themselves or risk humiliation. Drinking was both social ritual and endurance test. By the mid-20th century, alcohol was fully integrated into global culture. Every country had its drinks. Every region had its traditions. Alcohol was advertised, romanticized, and consumed at unprecedented levels. The post-World War II economic boom brought prosperity, and with it, increased drinking. The cocktail party became a symbol of mid-century American success. Martinis, Manhattans, and old fashions were sophisticated, glamorous, and alcoholic. The 1960s and 70s brought shifting attitudes. The counterculture movement experimented with drugs, but also re-examined alcohol. Some rejected it as part of the establishment. Others embraced it alongside everything else. Wine culture expanded. California vineyards began competing with European wines. Napa Valley became internationally recognized. Wine snobbery became a hobby. Craft beer emerged in the 1980s and 90s. Small, independent breweries started producing beers that weren't mass-market lagers. IPAs, stouts, porters, and experimental brews proliferated. Beer geeks debated hops and malts with the intensity of wine connoisseurs. Brewpubs opened in cities across America and Europe. Beer festivals became pilgrimage sites. The craft beer movement was partly a rejection of corporate homogenization and partly an excuse to drink more interesting beer. Cocktail culture experienced a renaissance in the 2000s. Bartenders became mixologists. Classic cocktails returned. Speakeasy-themed bars, which is deeply ironic, became trendy. People paid $18 for artisanal cocktails made with house-made bitters and obscure liqueurs. The craft cocktail movement emphasized quality, technique, and presentation. It also emphasized pretension, but that's unavoidable. Wine continued its upward trajectory. Wine tourism boomed. People visited Tuscany, Bordeaux, Napa, and Mendoza to tour vineyards and taste wines. Wine education became an industry. Sommeliers developed elaborate certification systems. Wine criticism became a profession. People spent thousands on bottles of wine that tasted, to the average person, like expensive grape juice. But it was sophisticated, expensive grape juice. Distilleries expanded globally. Japanese whiskey, once dismissed, became internationally acclaimed. Indian whiskey gained recognition. Mexican mezcal found a niche market. Artisanal gins proliferated. Vodka brands marketed themselves as ultra-premium despite vodka being, by definition, flavorless. The alcohol industry became vast, diverse, and incredibly profitable. And yet, drinking rates in many developed countries began declining in the 21st century. Younger generations drink less than their parents. Gen Z, in particular, is notably more sober. Health consciousness, mental health awareness, and changing social norms all contribute. The cultural assumption that socializing requires alcohol is weakening. Non-alcoholic beer, wine, and spirits have improved dramatically. Sobriety is no longer social suicide. This is a significant shift. For most of human history, not drinking marked you as strange, religious, or ill. Now, it's increasingly normal. The long arc of human alcohol consumption, which started in Neolithic China and peaked in 19th century America, may finally be bending toward moderation, or maybe not. History suggests humans will always find reasons to drink. Celebrations, commiserations, boredom, stress, social obligation, the excuses are endless and universal. Alcohol is woven into human culture so deeply that untangling it seems impossible. Every major religion except Islam has incorporated it. Every cuisine pairs with it. Every social milestone involves it. So when did people start getting wasted? Roughly 9,000 years ago, and we haven't really stopped. We've changed what we drink, how we drink it, and who gets judged for drinking too much. But the fundamental human impulse to ferment things and consume the results has remained constant. It's one of humanity's most enduring hobbies, right alongside agriculture, warfare, and complaining about the younger generation. And now, as you drift off to sleep, you can rest assured that somewhere, right now, someone is continuing this ancient tradition. Someone is brewing beer, fermenting wine, distilling spirits, or just opening a bottle and pouring a drink. They're participating in a ritual that stretches back to the dawn of civilization. They're getting wasted, just like their ancestors did. And honestly, there's something almost beautiful about that continuity. Sleep well. Hey everyone, tonight we're drifting back to ancient Egypt, to the final chapter of the Ptolemaic dynasty, and to one of history's most famous power couples. We're talking about Cleopatra and Mark Antony, the queen who supposedly dissolved a pearl in vinegar to win a bet, and the Roman general who abandoned an empire for her. So settle in, dim the lights, and let's explore a love story that ended with snakes, suicide, and the fall of an ancient kingdom. Because here's the thing about Cleopatra. Almost everything you think you know about her is probably wrong. She wasn't Egyptian, ethnically. She was Greek, Macedonian Greek. Specifically, her ancestor, Ptolemy I, was one of Alexander the Great's generals who grabbed Egypt after Alexander died and decided to stay. The Ptolemies ruled Egypt for 3 centuries, speaking Greek, worshipping Greek gods, and occasionally remembering there were supposed to be pharaohs. Cleopatra VII, the famous one, was born in 69 BCE. She was one of many children born to Ptolemy XII, a king so ineffective he was nicknamed Olitz, which means the flute player, not because he was musical, because he was seen as frivolous and weak. Ptolemy XII spent most of his reign desperately trying to stay on Rome's good side, because by this point, Rome was the dominant power in the Mediterranean and could crush Egypt whenever it felt like it. The Ptolemaic dynasty had a charming tradition: incest. Brothers married sisters, uncles married nieces. It was considered politically essential to keep the bloodline pure, which is the same excuse every royal family uses before their descendants start looking like Habsburg portraits. Cleopatra's parents were probably siblings. Her grandparents were definitely siblings. The family tree didn't branch so much as fold back on itself repeatedly. Cleopatra grew up in Alexandria, one of the ancient world's great cities. Alexandria had the famous library, the lighthouse, the museums. It was cosmopolitan, wealthy, and sophisticated. Cleopatra received an excellent education. She spoke multiple languages: Greek, Egyptian, Aramaic, possibly Hebrew and Latin. This was unusual. Most Ptolemies didn't bother learning Egyptian. Cleopatra did, which made her the first Ptolemaic ruler in 300 years who could actually speak to her subjects without a translator. This small gesture of cultural respect made her wildly popular with native Egyptians. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra was 18. She became co-ruler with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was about 10. They were also married to each other. Because the marriage was purely political. Cleopatra had no intention of sharing power with a child, and Ptolemy XIII's advisors had no intention of letting her rule alone. Conflict was inevitable. Within a few years, Cleopatra and her brother were at war. Court politics turned violent. Cleopatra fled Alexandria and raised an army. She was preparing to march on the capital when Julius Caesar showed up in 48 BCE, chasing his rival Pompey after the Battle of Pharsalus. Caesar arrived in Alexandria, expecting to rest, resupply, and maybe sort out Egypt's civil war as a side project. Instead, he got immediately pulled into the Ptolemaic family drama, which was ongoing and intense. Ptolemy XIII's advisors, hoping to curry favor, murdered Pompey and presented his severed head to Caesar. Caesar was reportedly horrified, which seems slightly hypocritical given that he and Pompey had been fighting a civil war. But Romans had standards about these things. Cleopatra, recognizing an opportunity, needed to meet Caesar. But she couldn't just walk into the palace because her brother's forces controlled the city. So she allegedly had herself smuggled into Caesar's quarters, rolled up in a carpet, or possibly a laundry sack. The sources disagree. Either way, she arranged a dramatic entrance, which worked. Caesar was intrigued. Now, there's a common narrative that Cleopatra seduced Caesar with her beauty. This is Roman propaganda. Cleopatra wasn't described as particularly beautiful by ancient standards. Plutarch, writing later, said her charm came from her intelligence, wit, and conversation. Ancient coins showing her profile suggest she had a prominent nose and a strong chin. Not conventionally attractive by Greek or Roman standards, but she was charismatic, educated, and politically savvy. That was more valuable than a pretty face. Caesar was 52. Cleopatra was 21. He was a battle-hardened general and politician who had just won a civil war. She was a young queen fighting for her throne. They formed an alliance, both political and personal. Caesar supported Cleopatra against her brother. The Alexandrian War followed, brief and messy. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the Nile while fleeing. Problem solved. Caesar installed Cleopatra as queen, married her to her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, who was 12 and completely powerless. Cleopatra ruled Egypt with Caesar's backing. She also became pregnant. In 47 BCE, she gave birth to a son she named Caesarion, Little Caesar. Caesar never officially acknowledged him, which was politically wise. Romans didn't approve of foreign entanglements, especially ones that produced potential heirs outside Rome. Cleopatra and Caesarion traveled to Rome in 46 BCE. Caesar installed them in one of his estates across the Tiber. This was scandalous. Caesar was married to Calpurnia. He was openly hosting his foreign mistress, and their child in Rome. Roman society was appalled and fascinated. Cleopatra's presence in Rome was a political statement. Egypt was wealthy, powerful, and aligned with Rome's greatest general. But then, in March 44 BCE, Caesar was assassinated, stabbed 23 times on the floor of the Senate by men who feared he was becoming a king. Cleopatra's position collapsed overnight. She fled Rome immediately, returning to Egypt. Her brother-husband Ptolemy XIV conveniently died shortly after, possibly poisoned. Cleopatra made Caesarion her cupola. He was 3 years old. Rome descended into another civil war. Caesar's assassins, led by Brutus and Cassius, fought against Caesar's allies, led by Mark Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. These three formed the second triumvirate, dividing Rome's territories among themselves. Mark Antony got the eastern provinces, Octavian got the west, Lepidus got Africa and was mostly ignored. Antony was a soldier, a career military man, loyal to Caesar, charismatic, and famously fond of drinking. He was also married, though this didn't concern him much. After defeating Brutus and Cassius at Philippi in 42 BCE, Antony began touring the eastern provinces, securing loyalty and collecting taxes. He summoned Cleopatra to meet him in Tarsus, in modern-day Turkey. This is where the legend really begins, because Cleopatra didn't just show up. She arrived in a golden barge with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Venus. Her attendants were dressed as nymphs and cupids. Incense burned, musicians played. It was theater, calculated, expensive theater designed to impress a Roman general who had seen everything. It worked. Antony was 41. Cleopatra was 28. He was Rome's most powerful general in the East. She was Egypt's wealthiest queen. They needed each other. Antony needed Egypt's money and grain to fund his armies and feed Rome. Cleopatra needed Antony's military protection to keep her throne. The alliance made sense politically, but it also became personal. Antony followed Cleopatra back to Alexandria and spent the winter of 41 to 40 BCE there. They formed a drinking club called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to extravagant parties and elaborate banquets. Plutarch describes feasts where the excess was absurd. Entire boar roasts prepared at different times, so one would be perfectly done whenever Antony wanted to eat. Lavish dishes, rare wines, endless courses. They drank, they gambled, they wandered Alexandria at night in disguise, playing pranks on citizens. Romans back home were not impressed. Antony had responsibilities. He had a wife, Fulvia, who was busy starting a war with Octavian on Antony's behalf back in Italy. He had provinces to govern. Instead, he was partying in Egypt with a foreign queen. Roman propaganda painted him as weak, corrupted by Eastern decadence, enslaved by Cleopatra's seductions. This narrative stuck. In 40 BCE, Antony finally left Egypt to deal with the political mess in Rome. His wife, Fulvia, died conveniently, possibly from stress. Antony reconciled with Octavian and married Octavian's sister Octavia to seal their alliance. This was standard Roman politics. Marriages were treaties. Divorce was policy adjustment. Personal feelings were irrelevant. Cleopatra, meanwhile, gave birth to twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, named after the sun and moon. Antony didn't return for 3 years. He was busy campaigning in Parthia, Rome's eastern rival, trying to succeed where Caesar had planned to go. The Parthian campaign was a disaster. Antony lost thousands of men and retreated in disgrace. He returned to the east in 37 BCE and immediately sent for Cleopatra. He needed money, supplies, and ships. She had all three. He also, apparently, missed her, or at least missed her resources, possibly both. They reunited in Antioch, and this time Antony didn't leave. He abandoned his wife Octavia, which was politically catastrophic. Octavia had done nothing wrong. She was loyal, dignified, and Octavian's sister. Divorcing her was effectively declaring war on Octavian, but Antony didn't care. He stayed in the east with Cleopatra. He acknowledged the twins as his children. He gave Cleopatra territories, parts of Lebanon, Syria, Cyprus, Crete. He was redistributing Roman land to a foreign queen, which Romans viewed as treason. In 36 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Antony now had 3 children with Cleopatra and none with his Roman wife. He was publicly behaving like an Eastern monarch, not a Roman magistrate. He wore Greek clothing. He participated in Egyptian religious ceremonies. He and Cleopatra presented themselves as divine rulers, Isis and Dionysus incarnate. The Romans were scandalized. Octavian, back in Rome, exploited this brilliantly. He launched a propaganda campaign painting Antony as a traitor seduced by an Eastern witch queen. Cleopatra was depicted as a scheming, power-hungry foreigner who had corrupted a noble Roman general. She was the enemy of Rome, the existential threat to Roman values. This wasn't entirely propaganda. Cleopatra did want power. She wanted to restore Egypt's historical territories and secure her children's future. She saw Rome as a partner and a tool. She wasn't some innocent victim of Roman imperialism. She was playing the same power games as everyone else. She just lost. So Antony and Cleopatra are ruling the Eastern Mediterranean together, acting like divine monarchs, and Rome is collectively losing its mind, because Romans had very specific ideas about how power should look, and this wasn't it. In 34 BCE, Antony held a ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria. It was pure political theater, and it was the beginning of the end. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones. Their children sat beside them on slightly smaller thrones, because even toddlers needed seating arrangements. Antony declared Cleopatra Queen of Kings and Caesarion King of Kings. He proclaimed Caesarion the legitimate son of Julius Caesar, which was a direct insult to Octavian, who claimed to be Caesar's heir. Then Antony started handing out territories like party favors. Alexander Helios got Armenia, Media, and Parthia territories Rome didn't actually control yet, but details. Cleopatra Selene got Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus got Syria and Cilicia. These were Roman provinces, or territories Rome claimed. Antony was giving them away to his half-Egyptian children. Romans were appalled. The ceremony was deliberately provocative. Antony was presenting himself as an Eastern king, not a Roman magistrate. He was suggesting that the future of the Roman Empire lay in the East, in alliance with Egypt, under a Hellenistic Egyptian power structure. This was ideological heresy to Romans, who believed Rome's strength came from its republican traditions and Italian identity. Octavian had been waiting for this. He seized Antony's will from the Vestal Virgins illegally, but effectively unread it publicly. The will allegedly stated that Antony wanted to be buried in Alexandria next to Cleopatra, not in Rome. Whether the will actually said this or Octavian fabricated it is debated, but it didn't matter. The damage was done. Antony had symbolically rejected Rome. Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This was clever. Romans wouldn't support a civil war against another Roman, but they'd support a war against a foreign queen. Cleopatra was presented as the enemy, an Oriental despot threatening Roman liberty. Antony was just her unfortunate puppet. By 32 BCE, war was inevitable. Antony and Cleopatra had a massive fleet and a substantial army. They controlled the eastern provinces, Egypt's wealth, and the loyalty of client kings across the region. Octavian controlled Italy and the western provinces. It should have been a fair fight. It wasn't. Antony and Cleopatra made strategic errors almost immediately. They stationed their fleet at Actium, on the western coast of Greece, but failed to secure adequate supplies. Octavian's general, Agrippa, was a brilliant strategist. He cut Antony's supply lines, raided his outposts, and waited. Antony's army, camped near swamps, suffered from disease and desertion. Morale collapsed. Cleopatra wanted to retreat to Egypt, regroup, and fight later. Several of Antony's advisors agreed, but Antony's Roman pride demanded a decisive naval battle. He couldn't flee. That would confirm everything Octavian said about him. So he committed to a sea battle at Actium, despite having fewer ships and a demoralized crew. The Battle of Actium, fought on September 2nd, 31 BCE, was anticlimactic. The fleets engaged, but Antony's ships were sluggish and poorly manned. Cleopatra's Egyptian squadron, carrying the war treasury, suddenly broke through the line and sailed for Egypt. Antony, seeing her leave, abandoned his fleet and followed her in a small ship. His remaining forces, leaderless, surrendered to Octavian. Antony's decision to abandon his fleet became legendary proof of Cleopatra's corrupting influence. Roman propaganda claimed she fled in cowardice and he followed like a lovesick fool. In reality, the battle was already lost. Antony's ships were deserting. Escape with the treasury was the only rational option. But rationality didn't matter. Perception did. Antony and Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, knowing Octavian would follow. They spent the winter of 31 to 30 BCE in denial and despair. They threw parties, they prepared defenses, they sent embassies to Octavian, begging for terms. Octavian ignored Antony's requests and sent messages to Cleopatra suggesting he'd negotiate if she betrayed Antony. She refused. They founded a new drinking club, replacing the inimitable livers with partners in death. The name was grimly appropriate. They knew how this ended. Octavian was coming with overwhelming force. There would be no mercy. They were living on borrowed time. Antony tried to rally his remaining forces, but his soldiers were deserting. His allies were switching sides. His cavalry commander defected to Octavian, taking his troops with him. Egypt's client kings abandoned Cleopatra. By summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's army was marching on Alexandria. Antony led a small cavalry force out of the city in a desperate defense. They were crushed. His remaining ships and soldiers surrendered without fighting. He returned to Alexandria, defeated, betrayed, and alone. A false rumor reached him that Cleopatra was dead. He had nothing left. So Antony did what defeated Roman generals did. He fell on his sword, except he botched it. The wound was fatal, but not immediate. He lay bleeding, in agony, and then learned Cleopatra was actually alive. She'd locked herself in her tomb with her handmaidens, preparing for Octavian's arrival. Servants carried the dying Antony to her tomb. They hauled him up through a window because Cleopatra refused to open the doors, fearing Octavian's soldiers. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms. He was 53. They'd been together, on and off, for 11 years. He'd gambled his career, his reputation, and his life for her, and for a vision of a shared Greco-Roman empire that might have actually worked. But it didn't. And now he was dead, and she was trapped. Cleopatra was 39. She'd survived her father's incompetence, her brother's civil war, Caesar's assassination, and a decade of Roman politics. She'd ruled Egypt for 21 years, outlasting countless rivals. But now, finally, she was out of options. Octavian took Alexandria without resistance. He sent soldiers to capture Cleopatra before she could kill herself, because he needed her alive. She was the prize. He was planning a triumph in Rome, and parading Egypt's queen in chains through the streets was essential to his victory. Cleopatra knew this. She'd seen what happened to defeated foreign leaders in Roman triumphs. They were humiliated, then executed. She negotiated with Octavian, buying time. She met with him, tried to charm him, and allegedly attempted seduction. It didn't work. Octavian was Caesar's heir, but not Caesar. He was cold, calculating, and immune to whatever magic Cleopatra supposedly wielded. He treated her politely, but firmly. She was his prisoner. Cleopatra asked to visit Antony's tomb to make offerings. Octavian, confident she was secure, allowed it. She said goodbye to Antony, made her offerings, and returned to her quarters. Then, on August 10th or 1230 BC, either sources disagree, Cleopatra killed herself. The manner of Cleopatra's death is history's most famous mystery, wrapped in legend. Everyone knows the story. She died from a snake bite. An asp, specifically, smuggled into her quarters in a basket of figs. She let it bite her arm or her breast, depending on which version you read. The poison acted quickly. She died relatively peacefully, reclining on a golden couch, dressed in royal regalia. It's a perfect story, dramatic, exotic, and tragic. The snake symbolizes Egypt. The asp was associated with Egyptian royalty. The cobra appeared on the pharaoh's crown. Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, dying from a symbol of Egyptian power, is poetically perfect, which is exactly why historians are skeptical. Because here's the thing, snake venom doesn't work that way. Cobra bites are painful, cause swelling, and take hours to kill. Cleopatra died quickly, with minimal visible damage. Octavian's guards found her dead on her couch, with two of her handmaidens, Iris and Charmian. Iris was already dead. Charmian was dying. There were no obvious wounds. No snake was found in the room. Plutarch, writing 150 years later, says some people believed Cleopatra used an asp, but he admits no one knew for sure. He mentions another theory, that she kept poison hidden in a hollow hairpin or cosmetic box and drank or applied it when ready. This makes more sense. A fast-acting poison, possibly a mixture of hemlock, wolfsbane, and opium, would explain the symptoms. It would also be much easier to conceal than a live snake. But the snake story is what survived. It's what every painting, movie, and book depicts. Because Cleopatra understood image. Her entire life was performance, from the golden barge at Tarsus to the donations of Alexandria. Dying theatrically, with symbolism intact, would be perfectly in character. If she orchestrated the snake story as her final act of propaganda, it worked brilliantly. Octavian was reportedly furious. He'd wanted her alive for his triumph. Instead, she'd denied him. She died on her terms, as a queen, not as a captive paraded through Rome. She'd won the last move in the game, even though she'd lost everything else. Octavian had Caesarion hunted down and killed. The boy was 17, old enough to be a potential rival. Octavian couldn't risk Caesar's alleged son challenging his claim to Caesar's legacy, so Caesarion died, probably strangled or poisoned. The last male heir of the Ptolemaic dynasty was eliminated. Egypt's 3,000-year tradition of pharaonic rule ended with an execution. Cleopatra's other children survived. Octavian brought Alexander Helios, Cleopatra, Selene, and Ptolemy Philadelphus to Rome and displayed them in his triumph, walking in chains behind an effigy of their dead mother. Then he handed them over to his sister, Octaviantine's abandoned wife Thures, which is deeply strange. Octavia raised her dead husband's children by his mistress. She did so gracefully, because Octavia was apparently a saint. Cleopatra Selene grew up in Rome, received a Roman education, and was eventually married off to Juba II, king of Mauritania, a Roman client state in North Africa. She became a queen again, ruling alongside her husband. She named her son Ptolemy. The Ptolemaic line technically continued through her. There was minor royalty in a Roman satellite kingdom. Cleopatra Selene died around 06 BCE. Her brothers, Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus, disappeared from history, probably died young. We don't know. Egypt became a Roman province, not a regular one though. Octavian treated Egypt as his personal property. Senators weren't allowed to visit without permission. Egypt's grain-fed Rome. Its wealth funded Octavian's transformation from military dictator to Augustus, the first Roman emperor. The Roman Republic, already dying, was finished. The empire began, and Cleopatra became a legend. Roman writers vilified her for centuries. She was the foreign seductress who corrupted noble Romans. She was ambitious, manipulative, and dangerous. She represented the exotic, decadent East that threatened Roman virtue. This propaganda was so effective that it's still the dominant image, but it's not accurate. Cleopatra was a brilliant politician who ruled Egypt competently for 2 decades during impossible circumstances. She maintained Egyptian independence while navigating Roman imperialism. She allied with Julius Caesar, then Mark Antony, not through seduction, but through strategic partnership. She spoke multiple languages, understood economics, managed a complex bureaucracy, and commanded armies. She was vastly more educated than most Roman senators. She wasn't some femme fatale. She was a ruler desperately trying to preserve her kingdom's independence in a world dominated by Rome. She failed, but not because she was weak or incompetent. She failed because Rome was unstoppable. Egypt's wealth made it a target. Its independence was always temporary. If not Octavian, then someone else would have conquered it. Cleopatra lasted longer than any successor to Alexander the Great had a right to expect. Her relationship with Antony was genuinely affectionate by all accounts, but it was also strategic. They needed each other. She needed military protection. He needed money and grain. Their children were bonds sealing the alliance. The drinking clubs, the parties, the elaborate displays, these were politics through theater. They were building a public image of divine partnership. Whether they actually loved each other is unknowable. Antony chose to follow Cleopatra when she fled Actium instead of staying with his fleet. He could have stayed, surrendered to Octavian, and possibly negotiated mercy. Instead, he chose exile with her. When he thought she was dead, he killed himself. Those are actions suggesting real emotion beyond politics. Cleopatra had opportunities to betray Antony. Octavian offered her terms multiple times if she'd abandon him. She refused. She stayed in Alexandria when she could have fled to India or Arabia with Egypt's treasury. She chose to die rather than be paraded through Rome. That suggests loyalty, or love, or at least stubborn pride. Probably all three. The pearl story, by the way, is probably false. Pliny the Elder wrote that Cleopatra owned 2 enormous pearls worth millions. She supposedly dissolved one in vinegar during a banquet to prove she could host the most expensive dinner in history. She won a bet with Antony over who could throw the most extravagant feast. It's a great story. It's also chemically questionable. Pearls don't dissolve quickly in vinegar, and drinking vinegar with dissolved pearl sounds unpleasant. But it illustrates Cleopatra's reputation: excessive, theatrical, and casually wasteful of unimaginable wealth. Whether or not she actually dissolved a pearl, she had the wealth to do it. Egypt was absurdly rich. The Nile's annual flood made Egyptian agriculture the most productive in the ancient world. Egypt's grain fed the Mediterranean. Its gold came from Nubia. Its trade routes stretched to India. Cleopatra's wealth dwarfed most Roman fortunes. Antony's alliance with her gave him resources Octavian couldn't match. If Antony had won at Actium, if his soldiers hadn't deserted, if the battle had gone differently, we'd remember Cleopatra as the queen who helped reshape the Roman Empire into a Greco-Egyptian hybrid. But she lost, and losers don't write history. Romans wrote Cleopatra's story, and Romans hated her. She was the foreign queen who almost destroyed Rome. She was dangerous, seductive, and un-Roman. This characterization stuck for 2 millennia. Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra immortalized the love story, but kept the Roman bias. Cleopatra is passionate, impulsive, and destructive. Elizabeth Taylor's portrayal in the 1963 film Cleopatra emphasized beauty and seduction. Modern depictions are gradually shifting, presenting Cleopatra as intelligent and capable, but the old stereotypes persist. The truth is more complex and more interesting. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh of Egypt, the last of the Ptolemies, and the last significant independent ruler in the Mediterranean before Roman dominance became absolute. She ruled during a transitional moment in history, when the old Hellenistic kingdoms were dying and the Roman Empire was being born. She tried to navigate that transition, to preserve her kingdom's independence by aligning with Rome's most powerful men. She succeeded for decades, but ultimately, the current was too strong. She died at 39, relatively young, having ruled for 21 years. Her children were raised by enemies. Her kingdom became a province, and her legacy was written by people who hated her. But she's still remembered 2,000 years later, which is more than most rulers achieve. She's a symbol, a legend, and a cautionary tale about power, ambition, and the inevitable collapse of empires. And somewhere, in the Mediterranean night, 2 lovers lie buried in tombs we've never found. Antony and Cleopatra, the Roman general and the Egyptian queen, together even in death. Whether they loved each other or just needed each other doesn't really matter anymore. They're myth now, frozen in amber at the moment the ancient world ended and the Roman Empire began. So rest now. The story is finished. Cleopatra drank the poison, or the snake bit her, or she simply willed herself to stop. Antony bled out in her arms. Their children were scattered. Egypt fell, and the long night of the Ptolemies ended, quietly, in a palace in Alexandria, on a summer day in 30 BCE. Sleep well.